I've got a little fact for you, and it may come as a surprise. The UK is the biggest consumer of illegal drugs in Europe, if not the world. But why? What you're about to hear is a story of violence, exploitation, a power struggle between the most feared gangs in the world. It's not always been this way though. It wasn't long ago that a new breed of criminal gang came here from Eastern Europe, and they changed everything. A new empire born, an illicit industry rewritten. In this episode, we'll unpack how the UK's drugs trade really works. Who are the masterminds behind it? Who pays the price? And crucially, why has the war on drugs failed? Welcome to the Crime Agents. Welcome back with me, crime journalist Andy Hughes.
And me, ex-cop Neil Basu.
So Neil, many people will be asking, why are we doing this now? Well, the reason is we are top of every drug league table in Europe for all the major drugs: cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, what have you, heroin, of course. Does that surprise you?
Well, unfortunately, not at all. With the small interlude where I was chasing terrorists, I spent a large part of my detective career chasing drug dealers who were normally violent gun criminals as well. So this doesn't really surprise me at all. I suspect that we've been near that top for a very long time. I'll tell you, I hope it shocks, not just surprises. I hope it shocks the listener, so we might actually start to have a conversation about it.
Said like a true law enforcer.
Well, you might be surprised. Let's get on to that.
All right. Okay.
Enforcement or education?
Yeah, we'll see. So it all kind of blew up in the 80s, really, and it was really because of one man, a man named Curtis Warren. He was known as the UK's Pablo Escobar. And what he did is he turned the industry from a national industry into an international operation. He actually made links directly with the Colombians, a cartel called the Cali cartel. These were the rivals of Pablo Escobar, and they were trying to take over from Pablo Escobar at the time. And what he did was he set up an operation where they would send shipping containers and cocaine in concrete blocks. And the authorities couldn't understand how all this cocaine was coming into the country. And the reason is he had someone who was on the inside at HM Customs who told him how long the drill is that they drill all the containers. So he built the concrete block far enough down that the authorities couldn't get to it.
That's a brilliant little backwards segue into our corruption line of duty in a different organisation. That's exactly what these people rely on, is inside people in the security system.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also dealt directly with Holland. And it was then that the drugs trade really, really got massive in the UK and got to where we are now. And then in the 2010s came the Albanian mafia. And again, they changed things massively. It was a wave of violence, and they completely changed the game.
Yeah, and in between those two moments, late 90s, early noughties, that was the explosion of what we feared was going to be a crack epidemic in the UK, and that had come over from the United States. So everything you've just mentioned there directly relevant. And then we had a whole generation of Caribbean yardies, as they were called there, slightly mistitled actually, but the yardies effectively teaching a second generation of young British black boys how to deal in cocaine. And we were incredibly concerned that crack was going to take off back then. And that was the whole formation of Operation Trident in London, which I worked on, which was the seedling, I think, for other similar organisations in Merseyside and Birmingham to deal with the gangs that you've described. So all of that in between Warren and in between effectively the Albanians, who were utterly ruthless, came the crack explosion.
Well, there is no person better to speak to and tell us more about that, Neil, than Tony Saggers, who's former head of drugs threat and intelligence at the National Crime Agency. And he joins us now. Thanks for joining us, Tony. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a real pleasure to be with you both discussing this. I'm very well, thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Tony, we've just been talking about how the drugs operations in the UK has gone from national to international. Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's moved with the time, with law enforcement resources, with our international footprint and our capabilities moving abroad. I mean, there's always been an international influence on the UK drug situation because most of what are consumed here are produced or grown elsewhere and then imported. I think what's happened on a sort of a major scale in the last 25 to 30 years is that the UK has increased its capability to pursue that threat by placing officers abroad, increasing our footprint and developing our relationships.
Tony, we've just been also discussing the Albanian mafia as they're known. Tell us about them and when they first came on your radar.
So I sort of prefer, to be fair, to call them Albanian organised crime groups. I think there's always a bit of controversy when we refer to them as mafia because of the Italian mafia sort of comparison. But they sort of appeared on the drugs radar from about 2010 onwards, albeit they were already on the organised crime radar. More significantly prior to that, involved in smuggling people, trafficking women and girls, and sexual exploitation through trafficking. But I would say in the last 15 years, they've become prevalent and dominant in the drug trade.
Yeah, I mean, Tony, I remember I was head of organised crime in the Met in 2014, and I remember the head of the proactive teams coming to see me about a particular Albanian organised criminal group they were tracking. She was absolutely astonished at the level of violence they were capable of. And they were also using, I think, black enforcement gangs that I'd been used to dealing with on Operation Trident. But that seemed to be a real step change in the capability and the violence associated with the drugs trade when the Albanians got into that.
Yeah, I think they certainly also brought, Neil, a reputation for that violence, which sometimes bizarrely kept the violence at bay because they were sort of seen as charismatic.
Feared.
If you do business with them and don't cross them, with the potential and the reputation for kidnap and extreme violence if you did cross them. So I think I saw them forge a presence and a dominance quite quickly on that basis, that they were good to do business with if you got on with them, with a fearsome reputation for the consequences of crossing them. And probably 2012 was when that really emerged for us. And I guess then if you think about how it starts to play out in the major cities around the country, of course, it makes sense that you're then seeing it actually play out.
How did you see the demand changing in your time in that job? I mean, when did it get to the point where we've featured so heavily as the biggest users in Europe?
I mean, I first saw this as early as the beginning of SOCA, the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and the end of the National Crime Squad era. 2006, the United Nations were collating and publishing data. I became involved in supplying that data from the UK, and of course then in conversations with the people analysing it. And it was that long ago that we were told we were pretty much Europe's largest market for demand for cocaine. In terms of the growth of it, it has technically become cheaper because what cocaine hasn't done is risen with inflation. So whilst most of the consumables that are legitimately sold into society have gone up in price, including alcohol as an example, the value of cocaine has stayed at £40 a gram and then £80 a gram for the sort of the top quality version of that. And that £40 a gram has been stable for 20 years now. So, with our economic market changing for most other substances, cocaine has remained stable because as the volume increases in demand, as will the supply, as will the competitiveness to get it to market, across the UK. And with that, the price has actually come down as the volume has gone up.
Tony, when you look at the huge numbers of people who use illegal drugs and you look at the huge amount of drugs coming into the country, has the war on drugs been lost? Has there ever even been a war on drugs?
I've refused to ever acknowledge a war on drugs, to be really frank, from a law enforcement point of view. I mean, that's what it gets called by a lot of commentators and onlookers. But if you think about what a war is, you don't win a war by ebbing and flowing your priority towards a problem, by throwing resources at it intensively for a short period of time, making a dent on that, and then easing off and focusing on something else. That's not a criticism. That's a reality of law enforcement's challenges to service many people's demands to a range of priorities. When the television cameras started to film migrants getting on the back of lorries in Calais while I was still in post, which would have been pre-2018, and whilst I had the drugs portfolio, I went from being a top-end priority, being constantly chased for data about performance with a relentless interest in how my portfolio was performing, to slipping down the league tables because public opinion, political opinion, was swaying towards the need to focus on people trafficking. Now, I get that as a priority, but it didn't necessarily have to be at the sacrifice of our approach to drugs. And then when people started to shoot each other in spates, themes and trends around the country, gun crime became a bigger priority, when most of the people that were shooting each other were doing it because they were involved in drugs crime.
I certainly remember that, Tony. I put a few away myself. So yeah, that was absolutely a massive issue at the time. And of course, that was Theresa May's big priority in terms of modern slavery, and is, of course, one of her big pastimes post her premiership now. She's still very involved in it. And like you, I think we all said, well, yeah, that is worthwhile, but it isn't, it's not the number one problem. And I think you've summarised it very well then. Thank you.
Tony, before we let you go, where are we at now? What is the biggest threat when you're looking at the drugs industry? Because we've seen a huge increase in fentanyl. We've seen a huge increase in county lines, which, of course, started under your watch. Where are we at now? And what's the solution?
So I'm going to have to break that down very briefly in response, because I think when you look at threat, you've got to qualify that in terms of what do we mean by it. Threat to our young people and general society on a day-to-day basis. I think county lines is still right up there as the number one threat to young adults and children, people having their addresses taken advantage of, and actually children being exploited on the streets of our drug threat. That's very much a high priority. If you look at the UK-wide threat from organised crime, for me, that's about cocaine. And as an association with that, Albanian organised crime plays a big part in it, but they're not alone. We saw through EncroChat the sort of the breakthrough on encrypted platforms for communication. Lots of white British and other British-based organised crime groups of British origin involved in cocaine trafficking. But that, for me, is the biggest problem. Demand is now 100 tonnes. Is the latest figure from the National Crime Agency, so sort of doubled within the last decade. And when you look at the sort of the wider threats, we're looking at dangerous developments within commodities, and with the Taliban currently causing a decrease in the flow of heroin towards the very strong Western market of which we're a part of, and that causing the dilution of the heroin that is available. The knock-on effect of that is finding a remedy to make the heroin that's being sold still potent, and that's where the Chinese produced synthetic opioids such as fentanyl and now nitazines pose an immediate threat, because the people that are injecting heroin who don't know what's in there will have no knowledge about the lack of dose control for those highly potent additives, and that has killed people instantly. I had that sort of portfolio in 2017 when it was happening in the northeast, and sort of I had the strategic lead on that, albeit at an operational level other things were happening on the ground, and we saw people dying within seconds of injecting heroin, not realizing it had synthetic opioids added to it.
I think, do the Scottish have the highest death rate in Europe from fentanyl now?
Yeah, because we've got the highest demand for heroin in Europe as well, and with diluted heroin because of a lessening in supply from Afghanistan, we're going to see those with it want it to go further and want it to remain potent. So it will get adulterated, which means it will be bulked in quality and reduced in purity, and then it will have additives put in it to make it seem like good quality, and that, of course, is what we've already experienced is often causing the deaths.
The question of what you would do differently in terms of policy, and I was also I was interested in what you saw were the most common, because border security is such an issue and was such a massive issue for me in a slightly different law enforcement realm, but is still a massive issue, of course. At the moment, it's all about illegal migration, asylum seekers and boat people, for want of a better expression. But actually, it's the weak security of borders and how drugs are actually being trafficked into the UK. So your very briefly, your impression of what were the most common routes, and then what is it about government policy that needs to change?
So common routes would be geographically relevant. So for cocaine, it's transatlantic, produced in Latin America, historically shipped into Rotterdam and Antwerp as the two biggest sort of entry points for that into Europe, and then moved back towards the UK via ferry terminals, southeast and northeast, most commonly. So Dover, Hull, Immingham. Brexit changed that. We saw tariffs being introduced for trade via the EU. Bananas and pineapples play a huge part in that. We're Europe's largest consumer of both. They are also produced in the same region as cocaine, so of course they provide cover in concealment form for shipments in containers. It makes no sense to move your bananas and pineapples to the UK via the EU anymore, because you'll be one of the few legitimate appearing traders to do that. So easy to profile. I predicted that. That's in a published report by Rusi Shock, the Strategic Hub on Organised Crime. And within months of that, we saw 4 1-ton plus seizures coming directly into the South Coast ports with bananas and pineapples.
Fascinating stuff.
Concealments. I didn't predict it in terms of cause it, but that happened inevitably. And with heroin, the land routes across Europe via Turkey as a gateway into the Middle East and towards Afghanistan remain the most significant, and that's much more about haulage and lorries and vans moving the heroin actually in the same direction along the same routes as people are being trafficked and smuggled.
Tony, just hearing you talk there, I just wonder how much of the drugs actually get stopped and caught by the police in terms of the ratio. Is it a case that the criminal gangs are just flooding these drugs in, and they know that the police will find some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the importation side, it's about Border Force, National Crime Agency, and the larger metropolitan forces that often target big organised crime groups. It's that collaboration that makes the difference. The problem is, quite simply, you buy a ton of cocaine in Latin America for, let's say, $5,000 a kilo, and you sell it in the UK for in excess of £20,000. If you lose a ton, you've lost 1,000 kilos at the $5,000 price. If you succeed in importing a ton, you've sold 1,000 kilos at £20,000. So when we seize a ton, and the government, as they used to when I was in post, would say to me, "What difference has this made to the market?" I would regretfully have to say, in terms of price, none at all, because had they successfully got 1 ton in last month, the profit from that is 3 to 4 times the loss of our most recent success. So economically, they're able to bounce back quite quickly. And whether it's a ton or a kilo, the elasticity in the margins from importing drugs from far afield into the UK is so wide that seizures alone don't make the difference that we'd like them to do. So what we have to do in order to feel that sense of genuine success is look at the harm those organised crime groups are causing, the reinvestment capability, the wider crimes that they're committing, their propensity to use guns to traffic people, to exploit and enslave women in the sex industry, take their money off them, disrupt them in that sense. And I was always looking for a genuine, legitimate, bigger picture success story when we disrupted an organised crime group, because if you just focus on the drugs, the demand in the UK is so high that the impact law enforcement is able to have will never be a percentage enough to reduce the size of that market.
Why do you think the demand is so high?
Do you know what? That's the question I've been asked over and over. Why is it when I've worked abroad in over 40 countries do I get mocked as the Brit that's going to be dancing on the table and being drunk by 10 o'clock at night?
That's Andy.
We've got a reputation for excess. We've also got a bit of a reputation for binging. I do think there's an element, I was discussing this with sort of academic colleagues a few years ago, about the stiff upper lip British mentality that we pretend that everything's all right, but we have to distract ourselves from reality. And I think perhaps drug taking is a distraction. It's a coping mechanism. It's a form of self-medication. But that doesn't actually fully answer the question as to why, when everyone's really in the same boat when it comes to the current state of the planet, why are we turning to drugs at a greater volume than any of our European neighbours? But we have always experimented with new substances. It's a fear of mine when it comes to education in schools with drugs. Children very often think about drugs and stereotype them as substances that you take, but don't really realise the consequences of doing it because the education has never been that great. So I don't know is the short answer, but I think as a nation we are inclined to do things to excess. We're inclined to binge. Binge creates habits. Habits create addictions and reliances. And rather than do little and often infrequently, we tend to be a nation that tends to do things on quite a grand scale to the point that we rely upon how that makes us feel.
Tony Saggers, thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you,
Real
Tony.
pleasure.
Brilliant.
Thank you both. Cheers.
Tony was fascinating, Neil. Did you ever come across him in your time?
No, I mean, I think I was knee deep in terrorism while Tony was at the height of his career dealing with this strategically, but he was awesome. I thought he's exactly the kind of person you want in law enforcement. His knowledge, if you were listening to that and you didn't know anything about the drugs trade, he's just given you a bit of a masterclass in 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Clearly, given the profession I was in, I know a lot of the detail there, but nowhere near the way he does.
I've known Tony for many years now, and there is no one that knows the amount he does about the illegal drugs trade.
But I thought what really came through was, for me, there was that philosophical bit about just why are we like this?
Yeah.
Why are we supplying these serious criminals with the money they need with our excessive demand?
Well, he said it's the same reason why he's probably going to be dancing on the table drunk later tonight.
I'm not sure that's exactly what he said, but also it's slightly upsetting, in terms of leadership. There was a little dig at law enforcement leadership, of which I was part, about not keeping their eye on this ball. A big dig, which I think was absolutely deserved because I saw it happen, about government taking its eye off this particular ball and not really realising exactly, just how harmful this particular subject is. Or how, I liked his thing about it's the drugs market and it's the organised criminals' whole market. It's not just about one crime type.
I'll tell you what I found really fascinating about that is just the levels these organised criminal groups go to actually get the drugs into the country. And what you said there about pineapples and bananas, I mean, we are as a country, we are one of the biggest importers of those two things.
We said we're the biggest consumers of it. I didn't realise that.
No, I actually knew that, funnily enough.
As long as you don't put pineapple on your pizza, you're okay, Brian. Don't do that, please.
Oh, no. Yeah, so, and what do those two fruits have in common? They're both perishable. And the customs legally can only hold it for a short amount of time because they need to get rid of it. Otherwise, it'll be of no use. So this, again, are these little methods that people might not realise that they're using.
The Brexit issue and the trade and the tariff and the legitimacy of that particular.
He did a paper once, probably the only paper I've ever actually read and found interesting, which was called Brexit and Bananas.
Brilliant.
And it was all about
as opposed to is Brexit bananas.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a paper I wrote in my spare time.
He talked about county lines. And we should probably expand on that just for people who don't know what that is. This is a drugs operation, which is a fairly recent phenomenon, would you say? That kind of came...
Yeah, less than 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. I would say 2017, 2018 have really started playing out on the streets of the UK. And this is where big organised criminal gangs, they used to get batches of loads of drugs from the city areas and ship them out to rural areas where they used to set up trap houses, shops, say shops, you know what I mean.
Trap houses? Do you want to just tell our listeners?
So a trap house is when a criminal gang will target a drug user, just say a crack user or a heroin user. They will go into their home, take it over, and basically say, we're here and you can't do anything about it. We're going to deal out of here until we run out of drugs. And that's what happened in all these kind of seaside towns in rural areas.
Those gangsters known as cuckoos who were doing
cuckoos, cuckoos. And this was happening on a massive scale. And this industry alone is worth and this is back when it first started, about 500 million quid a year.
And was pretty horrifying for the people it was happening to, because it was built on the success of some of the work we were doing in the cities, driving, effectively driving the gangs to try and find their profits elsewhere, because they knew we were looking at them. So this very clever ruse, clever, sinister, appalling, horrific child abuse, for want of a better word, of grooming people that they thought couldn't possibly be a target of our surveillance because they look like little kids with rucksacks, getting on trains, going out around the country, going to rural areas where those areas did not realise what was about to hit them in terms of antisocial behaviour, drug dealing on the streets, violence, all stuff that they had expected. If they came to London or Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds, they were not really expecting it on the coast of Suffolk or.
Yeah, and with the drugs came the violence in these rural places. And what the gangs were doing was they were exploiting these young kids who wanted to be in the gang. Here's a big bag of drugs. We'll pay you 10 grand when you come back. What happens? They come back. They say, no, you lost it. You lost the bag. The people we were dealing with didn't get the bag in the end. So, and then they would say, right, you owe us now. And then because of that, they would keep having to do these trips over and over and over again. It's just a young kid. He doesn't know any better, or she. There was many young female victims as well. This whole industry, the county lines industry, was built on exploitation of young, vulnerable people.
And I'm incredibly pleased to say that the policy switched into treating those young people as effectively being trafficked and enslaved.
It didn't start that way.
No, it did not.
But your lot were nicking them and throwing them in jail, locking them up.
And we can talk about adultification as another episode as well. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That was happening until you eventually realise that these kids are kids and they are being horribly exploited.
Yeah.
And they're in as you said, either a debt situation, being blackmailed with violence towards their family, violence towards themselves personally, but also because kids are malleable, haven't learned to think for themselves. They're looking at the gangster level above them and saying, I wouldn't mind a bit of that money myself.
Yeah.
I can't afford anything. I've been brought up on a estate. I've got no chance of getting a job. All of a sudden, they're being paid £1,000 a week.
And just lastly on county lines, I did a documentary on it with a team from Sky News in 2019, and we spoke to a county line. We got access to an actual gang who were running it, and they were saying they were in London, and they were saying that they pick on kids who are about 12 and just say, go to Southend with Uncle. And Uncle would be the person from the gang who was there to effectively mentor them, if you want to use that phrase. They would then go there with the uncle. The uncle would supervise them, show them how to deal drugs, and they would be there for 2 days. And then the uncle would then come back to London or wherever the big city it may be, and just leave this young 12, 13, 14-year-old kid to run a major drugs operation. It doesn't matter what happens to them. And then he'll be there at the back of the week to collect the money. How much money do you think that little kid got? Not much.
Yeah.
And we also spoke to one of the victims. She was a drug runner, but she was an elderly woman. Her son was in the gang. And then that guy fell out with the gang. So they then made his mother do the drugs runs for them and said, if you don't do it, we're going to kill your son.
There's a shocking sociopathy around drug dealers, isn't there? The money is, just to be very clear for our listeners, where there is drugs, there is violence.
Yeah.
Where there is drugs, there are unbelievable profits. Yeah. Those three things go together, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a lot about the glamourisation of drugs, and we're going to be getting into this after the break. In this section, Neil, we're going to be talking about a man called Howard Marks. He was nicknamed Mr. Nice. He was a very unusual drug smuggler. He was from the Welsh Valleys. He went to Oxford
Don't nod at me. I'm from the Welsh Mountains in North Wales.
I don't know why I did that. That must have been subconscious. But he went to Oxford. He was clearly very bright, and he started smoking weed with his mates, and he realised that actually he could smoke for free if he just bought it in bulk and dealt it along amongst his mates. But what happened is this escalated massively, and all of a sudden, after university, he then became a major drug smuggler, smuggling all over Europe. And in fact, one of his former uni mates worked for MI6 and found out about what a big player he was, obviously. So he was then recruited by MI6 to work for them. But that didn't really go well. And after a year, they stopped working with him. But actually, a few years later, he was caught with a huge amount of drugs. And then he went to trial, and then his defense was he was an MI6 agent. He still told the story about being an MI6 agent. And guess what? He got off. He was acquitted.
Do you know the reason why my old colleagues at MI6 didn't want to work with him in the first place?
All right, go on.
No, I don't know. I'm asking you.
Oh, right. I thought you were.
Because I can guess.
Oh, right, yeah. Well,
what a massive liability he would have been.
Well, exactly, yeah. I think
he wasn't going to give up this.
He wasn't the most trustworthy,
no.
I'm guessing. But he was later jailed in America for 25 years. He only served 7. And then when he came out, he wrote this book called Mr. Nice. It went on to become a massive success. Huge, top of the charts, Sunday Times bestseller. And he kind of became a cult hero, a cult figure. In a Hollywood movie later, he's still ingrained, and he is still a hero for many people, especially advocates of legalizing cannabis. Here's an interview he did shortly before his death.
Cannabis was the only drug I smuggled. I think largely because I wasn't really tempted to do anything else. The demand for cannabis wasn't met. If cannabis had been legal, I would have carried on being an academic in some sort. I do miss smuggling. You can never get that thrill, that I had from crossing borders, from writing. You can't. And I suppose if I thought I could get away with it, I'd crank it up today. I'd go back and do it. I mean, I loved it.
You're smiling there, Neil. Yes,
well, there's a bit
even you like him.
There's a bit of a God save us from the affable, amiable, charismatic drug dealer. There is that. Listen, I've contributed to his empire and his estate because I both watched all his documentaries, seen the film, and I bought the book.
It's good, the book,
and thanks for rubbing in the fact that it was a Sunday Times bestseller. I mean, I won't tell you how mine's doing. But anyway, I'm always slightly concerned that the portrayal of a drug dealer, regardless of the drug type, it's important to remind the listeners, cannabis is still a Class B drug in this country. That's still 5 years for possession. That's still 14 years if you're supplying it. So he was running the risk of a heavy sentence in this country of 14 years. And of course, the sentence he got in the States was considerably higher. But it isn't really, I mean, he might see himself, he's up there looking down on us, probably having a laugh and a spliff, and saying, I was on the right side of history when you look at the amount of legalization across the world that is happening with this particular drug.
Yeah.
And of course, in some respects, the decriminalization of it, when you look at how it's actually enforced by my old colleagues, where possession is largely considered.
It basically is decriminalized.
Yeah,
really.
It's basically considered. I imagine
Police officers.
85% of small possession use is not prosecuted at all. It wouldn't get much past a warning.
People
let
just
alone
get
a
told to
caution.
put it away now, basically, or don't be so blatant.
But I mean, you say smiling. I mean, there's a bit of me that when I was in anti-corruption back in 2000, we were chasing a person who at that time was known as one of the top 3 cannabis importers to the UK. But of course, before he was a cannabis importer, he was a cocaine importer. And he dabbled in Class A cocaine and heroin. And he had gone to cannabis because he realised that the penalties for being caught were much less. Now, did that make this particular organised criminal and his organised network any less violent? No, it didn't. Did it make them any less capable of corrupting the police officers, which is what we were doing, investigating him, as he had a little cadre of corrupt officers around him, all of whom conspired to help kidnap his accountant, who effectively had stolen, embezzled money from his empire.
Crikey.
And there is no doubt whatsoever, if you listen to the CCTV and the audio from a brilliant sting operation by my sister team, they were going to do him serious harm. Now, whether they were going to kill him was a matter for debate at trial, but they were definitely going to kidnap him and do him serious harm. And of course, the reason they got caught is the accountant wasn't stupid. He was an accountant and came running for his life to the police to turn supergrass.
Right.
That is all predicated on a cannabis importer who used to be a drug dealer. So the idea that people were all like Howard Marks, That is nonsense.
Yeah, and do you know who now is the dominant force in the cannabis industry in the UK? Guess.
I can't guess.
The Albanians.
Well,
They've taken
there you
over
go.
the
There you go.
cannabis. And they're saying that, people like Tony are saying that it is now one of the most, if not the most profitable drugs operations, which presumably why the most astute and fearsome gangs in the world are cashing in it.
Yeah, and they will have taken over from the Vietnamese, because I had a short-lived and guilty secret in that I was head of countering Vietnamese organised crime while I was in the organised crime department as a detective superintendent. And that was at a time that the Vietnamese trade in cannabis was taking off massively and was becoming very organised. So they were trafficking people into farms. They were taking over houses and turning them into major hydroponics activity. You know, we were famous for flying our helicopters over the top of housing estates with infrared on, capturing people who turned their central heating up too high and hadn't got any insulation, and also major cannabis farms. And that was the Vietnamese. And they were bullied off the plot by the Albanians.
No, they were. But it's fair to say Howard Marks was a bit different and a very charismatic person who kind of seemed to not only talk himself out of scrapes, but talked himself out of prison quite a few times.
Well, you heard he would have been an academic and a scientist and a professor if he hadn't been a drug dealer.
Very quick one, and I want you to be brief on this. Cannabis, is cannabis a gateway drug?
I'm not a medic, so I can't tell you that. But a lot of dealers...
What do you think, though?
Yeah, I think it's...
Do you?
I think it's
disappointing you.
I think it's a gateway drug in this respect. It won't be a gateway drug for a lot of people who only use cannabis, but it will be a gateway drug for dealers to introduce youngsters to the drugs trade.
Right.
And the reason I say this is
I think that's fair. But in terms of, because I know plenty of people who smoke cannabis recreationally who have never gone on to, these harder drugs.
I'm not aware of any medical evidence that says if you use cannabis, you're going to move on to a harder drug.
Well,
and I think the reason people say that is it's certainly not physically addictive and moving you on as a gateway, but psychologically, if you're the kind of risk taker who likes taking drugs, are you potentially going to experiment with something a bit harder? I don't know. These days...
One for the psychologist, Neil.
Well, and not only that, but cannabis has changed. Cannabis is not the cannabis that would have been around when you and I were growing up. And
you and I? You're lumping me into your generation, eh?
I say you and I were growing up.
I know we've got the same hairstyle, but come on, mate.
Can I just say to anyone who's watching this on YouTube, 15 years younger than me? Does it show?
Well, I had a tough paper round, Neil. Listen, we'd like to...
Cold one up there.
Yeah. We'd like to finish by thanking our listeners, because we've just passed 500,000 downloads. What do you reckon of that,
That's
Neil?
amazing. I thought it was just our wives pressing that button very, very fast.
It's my mother just pressing it over and over again.
Bless. Well, thank you to everybody who's done that.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll keep you interested in listening further.
Plenty more to come from us, that's for sure. Thanks again for listening to The Crime Agents. Make sure you've subscribed to us on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And remember, you can watch all of our main episodes on YouTube as well. So just search The Crime Agents and you can subscribe to our channel.
And we'll be back with another episode next Wednesday and a Q&A episode for you soon. And remember, if you've got any questions for us, either about our real life experiences or about anything in the news, please do send them in and we'll answer them as soon as we can.
And you can send them by email to thecrimeagents@global.com or follow us on social media. We're at The Crime Agents on all major platforms and you can leave a question for us there. Well, that's it. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
The Crime Agents.